Alright, ladies and gents, so this video is focusing on gas exchange that's occurring between your alveoli membranes and your capillary bed. So how we're actually getting gas from our lungs into our bloodstream, into circulation. So gas exchange. Gas exchange is going to happen, it's going to occur between your blood vessels and your alveolar air, so the air that's actually in the sacs in your lung. And what that does is it's going to cross this kind of wet membrane, this respiratory membrane that allows the exchange of these two, mainly the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. There are other gases that can come in and out, but those are the two that are moving the most, right? Those are the ones that we're using for cellular respiration. And the movement of these gases is actually dependent upon what we call the partial pressure of the gases. So how much pressure each of the individual gases that make up the air you're in get exchanged between the alveolar surfaces and your blood vessels. And so the diffusion of the molecules that are going to be occurring also between the mass of the gas and the liquid that is in your lungs is going to influence that. So the rate of diffusion also influences your ability to breathe or respire, and how that controls cellular respiration is what we're going to focus on. So if we're looking at air in the environment, air is composed of mostly nitrogen, oxygen, water, and carbon dioxide. So nitrogen essentially is a neutral gas. It's non-reactive because it's essentially two molecules that are two atoms of nitrogen that put together that form a triple bond. Super strong, it doesn't break down, it's very stable. And so because of that, we don't use oxygen. But it does influence the pressure of air, right? If you go to a place where we essentially change the relative concentration of oxygen, we're going to influence several different things. Oxygen gas in the air is about 21%, and that's going down because of global warming and releasing carbon gases into the air. But you also have water vapor, which makes up a good chunk of the air, and then about 0.5%, which is a lot still. And then carbon dioxide, which makes up about 0.4%, but that's a little higher than this estimate because this estimate's about 8 years old. So with this mixture of gases, that does influence how your air is going to move, but how the air and oxygen, carbon dioxide is going to be exchanged from different vessels. So based on the atmospheric pressure, we're going to have an influence on how much gas is going to push through and out. So we're going to have to compensate sometimes if we're in an area of lower atmospheric pressure, like if we're at a very high altitude, with how much work our chest cavity is going to have to do. And so because of Dalton's law, so a physical law that looks at the proportion of molecules in gas, that's going to influence how much we're actually able to exchange between it, because the concentration of gases are going to influence the exchange rates between the alveolar sac and the capillary beds. So if we're looking at partial pressure, so this video or this table here shows you what those partial pressures look like. So if we're inhaling air, right, it's going to have a certain amount of oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor. But depending upon our alveolar surface, so if we're in an area where we're saturated with oxygen and air, right, we'll have different levels of carbon dioxide and water. So like our lungs, our alveolar system has much higher water composition and much higher carbon dioxide than what's on the outside, right? Because we're getting rid of that carbon dioxide. So the exchange of gases is going to alter because of just the presence of water. And so when we exhale air, when we take in air, it's very different composition than the air that we get out. So the partial pressure is going to change. So the exhaled air is what we say is saturated with water, right? We're getting rid of this water vapor that's left over from cellular respiration, and we're getting rid of excess carbon dioxide that's going through here. Some of that stuff is going to stay dissolved inside of our lung tissue, but it's going to be released, right? We're still letting out oxygen and we're still letting out nitrogen, but that's essentially going to change because of the areas in which our lungs are, or how our lungs are constructed. So with this partial pressure in blood, essentially what's going to happen is our pulmonary artery, so that deoxygenated blood that's coming from our heart, right, leaving our superior vena cava and inferior vena cava through our right atrium and right ventricle to our pulmonary trunk and then to our arteries to our lungs, that blood is coming to us with a very low partial pressure of oxygen. It has a very low amount of oxygen compared to the carbon dioxide. And so because of this concentration gradient, right, you've got more O2 in the outside in our alveoli, and then we got less, so we got more oxygen out here than less oxygen out here. So oxygen is going to want to go into. So the opposite happens with CO2. Right? Across this membrane inside of our alveolar sacs, there's a higher concentration of CO2, low CO2 comparison here, right? And then that's going to start leaving. So as the concentration gradient causes this exchange, we'll see this rapid exchange because the concentration gradient is so high, it's going to want to even out as quickly as possible. So we'll reach this equilibrium each time we breathe. So this other gases are also going to influence this. So you have partial pressures that exist in our interstitial fluids, so the space between each of our cells, and then also just peripheral capillaries are going to have a very different concentration gradient than what's going to go in our lungs. Because we go through, we get to areas where essentially oxygen is much higher than what's going on inside of our cells, so our cells are constantly doing respiration. They're going to have um, a much higher increase of CO2 than they are O2. So the O2 is going to start leaving and leaching into each of our cells. So O2 will leave, right? And then carbon dioxide is going to want to go into our bloodstream. So it's going to leave our cells and go. Because the interstitial fluid around them has this differentiation and exchange, right? The oxygen is going to want to get pumped into it to try to even it out versus CO2, which will leave to try to lower it and again even it out. So if we look at this image here, this is showing our systemic circuit of our circulatory system compared to our pulmonary circuit, which is what's going on in our lungs. But what's going to happen is our deoxygenated blood, so it's going to have a much more even pressure here. So what's coming in, right? We have much less CO2 compared to what's, much more CO2 than we do what's having going on outside. So we're going to get oxygen in and CO2 out as we get into our capillary bed. So essentially the exchange is occurring in most of the parts in our lungs between our intake and outtake in our lungs. So as we go from there to our systemic fluid, right, we lose some oxygen on the way because it's slowly being leached out as we go. Again, our interstitial fluid is still going to have that original concentration that we had earlier. And so as that goes in, our oxygen keeps getting pulled out because it's so lower here. CO2 concentration is a lot lower in our blood, so then it's going to want to leave to even it out. So we end up closing that circuit and we're exchanging gases. Red blood cells essentially are the big cells that allow you to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide from peripheral tissues. And what that does is going to remove CO2 and oxygen from our plasma, which allows the gases to diffuse into our blood. So you often think or hear that the CO2 and stuff is getting picked up by your blood cells, and it's true, right? It's moving stuff from your liquid and then allowing that to get exchanged later as we change the concentrations of these atoms in the actual plasma. Oxygen is going to bind to the hemoglobin that's in your molecules. So there's an iron molecule that's in there, and this is a reversible reaction. So see, oxygen can bind and unbind. It can do it pretty easily. And so each red blood cell has about 380 million hemoglobin molecules, which means that they can each carry 4. So you have like ability to carry almost a billion oxygen atoms every time you, every red blood cell can do that. So you're taking trillions of atoms every time you breathe. And there are lots of things that can influence how effective your hemoglobin is. So some people have defectively shaped hemoglobin just due to genetic conditions, so the protein gets made wrong, which is kind of a genetic component of that. Environmentally, just depending upon how much oxygen is in your blood, can influence your effectiveness of hemoglobin. Blood pH, so buffer systems that are present can influence that because it's going to pull oxygen out sometimes to create different acids to react with hydrogen. And then you also have temperature. So the hotter you are, the less able you are to exchange gases. Um, and so carbon dioxide, the transport of this, is generated as a byproduct from respiration. So as you're breathing, doing cellular respiration, you're releasing CO2. And so that CO2 in your bloodstream, we looked at this image before where it showed how the CO2 stays pretty low. But your question is like, you're using this much oxygen, you're using quite a bit of oxygen, and you're going to be producing, you think, a lot of carbon dioxide. But what happens with that carbon dioxide is it doesn't just stay as a carbon dioxide gas. Sometimes it's converted into buffer systems, so like carbonic acid. So our blood is slightly acidic, so that carbonic acid is used as a buffer system to make sure that our blood stays at a pretty average neutral pH of 7. Sometimes that CO2 can be bound to hemoglobin, so it's actually being transported, or it can stay dissolved in our system, like we've seen before. Um, and so this carbonic acid will then react to other things like bicarbonate that's in our bloodstream that allows for us to take up this CO2 in case we're breathing too much, kind of keep control of that. That's not important. But CO2 in your bloodstream, so a lot of that actually gets transported as carbonic acid. So we don't just leave it as CO2. It gets and reacts with um, enzymes and substrate that's in your blood plasma to create carbonic acid. And this carbonic acid um, it can dissolve and produce these hydrogen ions and then carbonate, bicarbonate. And so by having the bicarbonate in there, that's that buffer system that's allowing our body's pH to stay more neutral. Some of it gets bound and used for amino groups, so we use it in our hemoglobin. And then a very little bit of it's actually transported as just dissolved CO2 in our blood. So all of these different pathways can happen, but essentially you have, again, your alveoli that has a high concentration of oxygen. So that's going to pass through to your red blood cells and into your plasma and pick up the oxygen. It's going to react to the hemoglobin ion. You can stick 4 atoms of oxygen to each of those hemoglobins. And so then from there, you get it through your systemic capillaries, so you're going through circulation, and there you're going to have exchange. So where you have a lower concentration of oxygen in your interstitial fluid, oxygen will leave, and then CO2 will come back in. Okay. So we control respiration in several ways. Due to, again, changes in blood chemistry. And so peripheral and alveolar capillaries are really the ones that maintain the balance of gas diffusion. So when those get off balance, you have major issues and can die. Changes in blood flow and oxygen delivery, or changes in the depth and rate of oxygen of respiration, are controlled by these changes here. So any influxes there can actually upset respiration enough to lead you to suffocate or die. So that's like essentially what suffocation is. You're changing these controls. So we control the respiratory centers in our brain by exchanging oxygen in our system. So cardiac output and respiratory rates can increase under our neural control. So our brains will actually control our need for oxygen. So it can be involuntary, so like something's happening physiologically and our body's just upping it. So if we have like a sudden release of hormones or something like that, our body, like fight or flight, for example, that can lead to a higher demand for oxygen, so you can run away. Both have voluntary and then so involuntary or voluntarily, like if you're exercising, doing cardiac kind of exercises or lifting weights or something like that, that's going to encourage your body to take in more oxygen in order to have respiration occur. So by regulating like respiratory muscles or regulating digestive system, you're going to have responses from your sensory systems into your nervous system to asking your body to say, hey, increase oxygen uptake, breathe more so that I can get what I need. Voluntary centers also include your cerebral cortex, where your thinking part of your brain, where you can consciously think that I should breathe more so I can like up my intake of oxygen, so I can like increase my rate of breathing because I can choose to do that. So I can cognitively do that, but I also have motor receptors in my pons, medulla oblongata, that's going to, again, encourage respiration, say, if I get signals that are involuntary. And we have different groups in which we do that. We're not going to talk about those that much. We're going to go over that. So just to then talk about inhalation versus exhalation and patterns that you can see with respiratory patterns. So with inhalation, if you're doing quick and quiet breathing, with inhalation, again, your inspiration must contract, inspiration occurs. You're going to get your different groups that are going to contract, encourage their muscles to relax, decrease your cause exhalation to occur essentially, and then that cycle continues. But with forced breathing, you're telling your systems to do this, right? You're causing that stimuli to get an increase in the rate of this reaction, okay? You're essentially sending that positive feedback loop to get that to occur. There are different respiration controls that are reflex related. So based on your sensory input, you can actually cause someone to increase more or less their breathing rate. So that can be things like being scared, stuff like that. But the big one, and one we've already touched upon a little bit, was baroreceptor reflex. So this is our body's way of trying to control how much oxygen is inside of our body. So if it gets below a certain point, our brain's gonna be like, I am starving for oxygen, breathe more. So you have your carotid and aortic baroreceptor stimulus. So there's this point in your carotid artery where we're actually measuring essentially how much carbon dioxide is in our blood. And so the amount of carbon dioxide, essentially we're sensing the relative amount. So if our CO2 is too high, it tells us our oxygen is too low, so we need to get more and more. And this can affect our blood pressure and respiratory centers, so it can actually increase it or decrease it. And so when blood pressure falls, our respiration is going to start increasing as well. So if our vessels get too dilated and blood pressure decreases, that's going to increase respiration, because as blood pressure decreases, the amount of oxygen that's getting exchanged goes down. So that's going to encourage us to breathe. When blood pressure increases, though, that's going to cause respiration to decrease because we are forcing oxygen everywhere very quickly. So we're like, we don't need as much as readily, so respiration will slow down sometimes. So this respiratory reflex does come from your cranial nerves, and they're also so like 9 and 10, which we didn't talk about our cranial nerves in any detail at all. But these are the receptors and the nerves that come off the base of your brain that then go to all the major centers in your body. And they're responding again to the amount of carbon dioxide, the pressure of carbon dioxide, the pH that's in your cerebral spinal fluid. So the fluid that's going through your brain and down your spinal cord. But we also look at our blood and try to make those comparisons. Okay. So that was just, again, a very quick run through of breathing and gas exchange that's happening in the alveolar level. So those 3 videos are respiration. So the one I did on just the structural parts of respiration and these 2. So you can watch the other one, make sure that you've seen them all, looked at them, and then if you have any questions, please ask. Thanks.